Good evening, students of British and American culture. Today is our final video lecture, and in fact, this is the final lecture of the term for me, so it is sort of a milestone for both of us. Thank you so much for listening to me. Obviously, at times, the videos in this class have gotten too long and quite complicated. I've attempted to consolidate the important things because I do tend to elaborate and go off on tangents sometimes because I feel like those details and those stories are very interesting and help you understand British and American culture better. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to be an expert about it as I am. And there are people who are much more knowledgeable than me. But this is kind of a stepping stone. I consider this an introduction to British and American culture, so you don't have to know everything. But there are key things from each week, from each lecture that you should know, and that's what I attempted to do for the study guide. So today I just want to encourage you that you don't need to memorize or know everything that I've tried to teach you this semester. I hope you remember the things that are interesting to you, but everybody is interested in different things. Some people may like kings and queens. Some people may like art and sports and entertainment, and some people might like military stuff. Some people might be more interested in economics. That is the beauty of cultural studies, is that culture encompasses everything that's within the human experience and what we call our lives, our experience and our lifestyle. So the things that I've chosen to talk to you about sometimes may have not interested you in particular, but some of the things that I have taught you, I do think you need to remember because they are important, events and they contribute to our understanding of our culture now. And that's why we started so far in the past in this course. So I'm really going to try and be as efficient as possible today. You have the study guide, you have hours and hours of lectures and notes, and you've done assignments. So I don't want to repeat myself. I just want to point you in the right direction so that next Thursday, when you come to the campus to see me for the first time, that you're not overwhelmed by the exam. It has been shortened. Normally the exam is 2 hours long, and it has more questions on it. The policy of the university has been to keep it to about an hour in length in order to reduce the amount of exposure we have to each other. Furthermore, our class is too big. So the first 40 students on the student list, I'm going to post the Excel student list again to the website just so you know. But if you're in the first 40 students by student number, you will be in room 124. And if you are the remaining 24 students, which are all freshmen, you'll go to the 4th floor and you will write in room 456. And that is because we have a capacity of 40 students in the room 124, where we normally have a capacity of 100. But because of social distancing requirements, we have to separate the students into 2 locations. So the bottom 24 students, and again, that Excel student list will be posted on the website this weekend, so you can look at your student number and see which room you're supposed to go to. The instructions have already been widely distributed. You have to wear a mask, you need to get your temperature taken, you need to bring sanitation wipes, you need to sanitize your hands, and you need to clean your desk before and afterwards. I was just given a notice today, I'm supposed to wear gloves. When you give me your exam, I can't shake your hand or anything. I know this is terrible, but these are precautions that are necessary. Nobody wants to be the one who makes everyone sick. So I will literally be wearing gloves when I take your exam from you. So these are all the requirements we have to follow in order to have a safe exam. Try not to focus on them. Try to focus on the test. And again, let me remind you, the grade policy is relaxed. So I don't have to give any C's at all. As long as you've made an effort and you do well, you handed in your assignments and you do well enough on the exam, you can get at least a B. I don't have to. I'm not required to give 30% of the class C's, which is our normal grade curve. So please relax, be safe, and do your best on the exam. So let's get into just the whole spectrum of things we talked about. We started out by talking about the first millennium, and it goes back before the first millennium, but there's 5 ethnic groups that you have to remember besides the English themselves, which we refer to as Anglo-Saxon. Those are one of the groups. So the first group is the Celts, and I want you to, I'm not going to tell you all the details about these people because I would be rehearsing and rehashing things that I've already told you before. So you need to know about the Celts, you need to know the key things about them. And then the Romans occupied, they made a place called Romano-Britain. There was a British province, Britannia, which is part of the Roman Empire. You need to know about them. The Germans are the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. But the Jutes were not very important compared to the other two, so we call them Anglo-Saxon. The Danes, which are the Vikings, what did they do? And then the Normans. Those are the 5 groups that you need to know. And the Normans carry over into the second lecture because we ran out of time. You need to know certain kings in that period. King Arthur is not a real king, but you need to know basically about what's important about him. Canute is the Viking king, who was also a great king. It's the information about him is written in the textbook. And Alfred the Great, who was an actual real king, who managed to save the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms from the Viking invasions. Edward the Confessor was the last Anglo-Saxon king. He didn't have any children. What's important about him is that the person after him, Harold Godwinson, he took over from Edward the Confessor, but he only survived 1 year because William the Conqueror came from Normandy and killed him and took over England, making it a Norman kingdom attached to the Duchy of Normandy. So you need to know about William the Conqueror. And finally, you need to know about Thomas Becket, because Thomas Becket was a very important figure in the church, and he had a struggle with Henry II over who was more important or who had control over, the law of the land. And in the end, Henry II got frustrated and asked some of his men, he asked basically anybody, will nobody, what does he say exactly? Will nobody rid me of this turbulent priest, I believe is what he exactly said. But basically said, will somebody take care of this guy for me? And so some of his knights did. And they sliced his head in half while he was praying in the most important cathedral at Canterbury in England. So he became the first English celebrity. So don't forget about him. Moving on. The third topic was about plagues and revolts. You need to know about the Magna Carta and why that is important. It's a document. It's helped equalize the power between the king and the barons, but didn't do very much for the poor people. They are still left out in the cold, so to speak. The great chain of being and the order of people from the king right down to the peasants, and the Pope being up there too. The Great Famine of 1315 that made everybody so sick and weak, so that when the Black Death came around in 1348, more people died than should have. There was also an overpopulation problem. As a result of the Black Death, there was a peasant revolt in 1381 because there was less people and they had gained a certain amount of money and freedom, and they didn't want to give that up, but the wealthy people wanted to keep them in sort of like a slave state. Not a slave state, it's called serfdom, but they wanted to keep them on their land working for a low cost. But after the Black Death, there was less people, so you could sort of look around for a better job, which people did. But in 1381, the king was trying to take that progress away, which caused everybody to start a revolt. Geoffrey Chaucer is known as the father of English because he wrote some things in Middle English when most people were still writing in French or Latin, he decided to write some very important works of literature in English. He's in the textbook. John Wycliffe also, long before Martin Luther King, started to believe that maybe everybody should be able to read the Bible and that we should be more egalitarian about, just as Jesus was, that rich people aren't the only people that should have access to the Bible. And why are Catholic priests telling everybody what the Bible says? Why don't we have the Bible in English, and why don't we try to understand it ourselves? That's why John Wycliffe is so important. Then we moved into the 16th century. As you know, one of my favorite parts. You can just say that England sort of changed in 1453 because that was the end of the 100 Years' War, so they lost, and they were detached from France. Basically, after that, they lost their territory from France, so they started to focus internally. And this sort of laid the groundwork for the connections between Ireland and Scotland, because instead of being focused on the continent towards France, England started to be more concerned about Scotland and Ireland. So the relationship between them, for better or for worse, started to become more important. You have to know about Henry VIII. There's too much for me to talk about. I talked about him a lot, but you need to know about basic things about Henry VIII. He did a lot of important things. After him, his son, Edward the Sixth, ruled and made things more Protestant, and then Mary took over when he died, and she tried to roll things back and make things Catholic again, and then she died too. So it ended up being Queen Elizabeth, who ruled for almost half a century, and she defines the 16th century at least as much as her father. Basically, it's Henry VIII at the beginning of the 16th century and Queen Elizabeth at the end. Between the two of them, you can understand the 16th century. What the most important thing is about the Reformation, how Henry VIII separated the English church from the Catholic Church, and the English had their own Reformation where they stopped being Catholic. That started making different parts of their religion. You got Puritans, Anglicans, Presbyterians, Dissenters, Diggers, all these different types. Also, during the 16th century, England started to explore and started to try and make colonies. Sir Francis Drake was a famous pirate, explorer, Navy officer, all three. In 1588, the Spanish Armada attacked, and they, because of some luck and because of some advantages in sailing skill and the quality of the ships, the English won, and a storm came in and did the rest. So England was saved from King Philip of Spain's great armada, which seemed to them to mean that they were chosen by God to do important things. This is sort of the beginning of manifest destiny right here, when the Spanish Armada is smashed by a storm. They start to think that God is on the side of the Protestants, especially the English. Then the 17th century, the main thing is going into that century, you have an English Renaissance. You have all these different writers, especially because of Queen Elizabeth and King James. King James makes the Bible, the King James version of the Bible. Shakespeare does all of his plays. There's many other famous writers besides Shakespeare: Spenser, Johnson, Marlowe. Sir Philip Sidney, you don't need to know them. You just need to know that there was a sort of development of English literature at the end of the 16th century, a sort of explosion. I think in the textbook I call it flowering, but it is an explosion. It's a sudden, productive increase where all these talented English people start writing. And John Milton does Paradise Lost and all that. But you don't need to know all the names. Just you need to know that English literature kind of just develops, starts to really take off at the end of the 16th century. So you need to know all those kings in order. King James, the guy who made the Bible, his son, Charles, who got his head cut off, Cromwell, who cut the king's head off, and he was on one side of the Civil War, Charles II, who comes back after Cromwell dies and restores the monarchy, James II, who becomes Catholic, and he gets kicked out and is replaced by William. We went all through that series of kings in particular, because it had such an impact on the development of British culture. So there's the Glorious Revolution in 1688 is the significant event at the end, and in the middle of the century it's the English Civil War. So you're going to have to look up, the details in terms of what I said in the lecture and what is written in the textbook, and just be familiar about, the parliamentarians are on one side, that's Cromwell, and on the other side you have the royalists who support Charles. Who wins? What happens? Oliver Cromwell takes over and creates something called the Commonwealth. These are the basic details you need to know, and they will be on the exam, no doubt. The next part we called the hard fork, which is about the New World. I described, and you did an assignment on these key ideas in American culture: freedom, manifest destiny, opportunity, beliefs, contradiction. I put a star individualism in there because that's just it. All of those 5 things can be connected to individualism, but those are the 5 things: freedom, manifest destiny, opportunity, beliefs, and contradiction. Those are the ones that I chose just to give you an idea of what we were trying to how we were trying to connect America now to America then, because those things still exist. And if you're following the news right now, you can see all the complicated ways that these ideas are still being demonstrated through people's behaviors and their beliefs. So this is the age of exploration, which means Christopher Columbus starts this whole process of all these people discovering and starting to develop the New World. Develop, you should put in air quotes, I think, because in some ways they destroyed it. So that's key to remember. We talked about how the damage that was done by disease and by design by Europeans, encroaching on North American territory and South American territory. In the middle of the century, there is, in 1763, the British win something called the 7 Years' War, which is a war that happens all over the world between France and England, and France loses, and the British win. So France gets kicked out of North America, and suddenly, for 20 years or so, all of North America belongs to the British. But they lose it very quickly because the British colonists decide that they don't want to be controlled by the mother country anymore. So you need to know about the American Revolutionary War, and the 3 main founding fathers I asked you to remember: Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, and Benjamin Franklin. Also, there is a section in the textbook about slavery, which we did discuss briefly, is one of those contradictions, right? Slavery is a contradiction because the whole culture is supposed to be based on freedom and equality, and yet they include slavery as part of their system, which does not make sense. Okay, so industrialization and imperialism come next. Literacy and education were the basic foundations for that movement. You need to know, a few key innovations. We talked about the steam engine and the spinning jenny, which was a spinning wheel that, rather than using it by hand, you could do a lot more faster because it was a machine that you could use pedals and levers and strings on, rather than just feeding cloth by hand, feeding raw wool into something, or cotton into a spinning wheel. That was called a spinning jenny. So you need to know the primary factors for industrialization, which are steam, iron, and textiles. You need to know the advantages and disadvantages of imperialism. The reason that the British Empire was so effective was because of sea power. You need to know about Horatio Nelson. You need to read about Victoria. Even though I didn't actually lecture about her, I think you need to know the basic idea of Victorianism, which is a conservative British culture. So that's all I want you to know. Just read that section about Victoria, and you'll see what I mean. All these things are named after her, but it's basically a culture of a superficial culture of behaving in very conservative manners and using proper behavior according to a certain Victorian code, but underneath, all sorts of other things happening. But on the surface, Victorian culture is still with us, because that is sort of still the idea of a British person having good manners and being a gentleman or a lady. That sort of that idea, it sort of got really condensed and focused on in this dichotomy of all this working class, dirty underground behavior happening, but on the surface everything being idealized and proper and prim and well mannered. That's what Victorianism really is like. It's unfortunately we didn't talk about Charles Dickens, but he sort of overlaps with that whole idea of Victoria. So remember, Queen Victoria, got to keep up appearances. If you want to be a good Victorian, you got to put on the makeup, the dress, the top hat, and have the manners. Otherwise, you're not a very good Victorian. Okay, next we had the 19th century, essentially. It was called A Tale of Two Empires. The Great Awakening involved Americans becoming religious. The Transportation Revolution involved just building lots of canals and railroads so that this huge territory of America could be connected. Everything started going westward. You can see the picture on the website of that ghostly lady floating with all the natives running ahead of her, and like the railroads and New York City in the background behind her. American industrialization. You got the American Civil War. You have to know about the Native Americans, generally just a characteristic or two about each tribe, primarily the Sioux, the Algonquin, the Iroquois, the Arawak, and the Apache. The Trail of Tears is when they were removed from the southeast United States forcibly. I believe it was Andrew Jackson who was the one who forced them out, but it was in the early 19th century that many of the tribes in the southeast area were forced to move to other reservations. We talked about Paul Bunyan, which is a tall tale. Davy Crockett, who's a real person, and there are sort of myths that and stories that Americans learn about in order to understand the values of America. And finally, at the end of the 19th century, the Gilded Age, where everything looks like it's really good quality, but it's just like Victorianism, really. Everything's covered in gold, but if you scratch it a little bit underneath, it's just dirty iron or a lesser quality metal. So it looks good on the surface, and all this progress and development looks good, but actually society itself and the economy even is not as strong as it looks, and that's why we call it the Gilded Age. The ninth section, the 20th century, we talked about World War I, before and after, what it was like. It was sort of like countries on steroids and how fast they developed. American expansionism as opposed to its isolationism before. Suddenly they start to become involved, fighting overseas, fighting with the Spanish, becoming, and then in World War I, going on the ground in Europe and fighting against Germany. So this muscular foreign policy starts to develop. The consequences of the British Empire being the main financial supporter of World War I, and then them spending a lot of that money on equipment and vehicles and ordnance and weapons from America, sort of ended up transferring the financial center of the world from London to New York. So you got modernism. We talked about what modernism means. Second Industrial Revolution, which means now you've got gas-powered things as opposed to coal and steam. The Second Industrial Revolution has different materials like steel, so things are faster and stronger, and you have airplanes and tanks eventually, and this is all part of the Second Industrial Revolution. The entrepreneurial spirit of the Americans doing things individually and taking on risk, and all these great business icons like Rockefeller and Carnegie and Vanderbilt, who build these huge private empires, and they're incredibly rich, and they just represent this ideal businessman type that's still with us in American culture too. Part of the reason that they're so good doing these things, like Henry Ford, for example, is the fact that and Carnegie, they're constantly improving their technology. They're constantly building new things. They're innovating, so they have an advantage over other countries. It's not just the size of the country or the resources or the number of the population. It's also that this continuing effort to improve and to progress, which is part of modernism as well. So yes, they win World War I, and they don't get damaged so much. So when it comes around to World War II, when America gets into that, and then they win again, they're on the winning side again, they sort of become this Pax Americana, this world presence where if anything happens anywhere, they intervene. And that's what the British did, during the Victorian era. If anything happened anywhere, the British were around, and they sort of mediated or tried to put pressure on people, various countries, to do certain things, which some people liked and some people didn't like. But it was certainly, it's called Pax Britannica and Pax Americana because it's relatively peaceful compared to, world wars. The American century, we're getting to stuff that we talked about recently, so it should be, there in the back of your head more so than the other things I've talked about. I divided the American century into 5 parts, 3 parts with 2 crises in between. So you need to know those things. You need to know about these basic ideas of democracy and how the American democracy is Republican, and that capitalism is the investment of money and private free market economics. Consumerism is another thing that drives the American culture. It's like just stuff. That's how you keep the economy going, is you buy more stuff and then you make more stuff, and then people need jobs to make the stuff and move it. And this is the idea that propels the American society forward. Communication and technology, all 4 of these things are fundamental to understanding why the 20th century is the American century, because they embraced all those things. And you can see in most of the countries, to a greater or lesser extent, it doesn't matter if it's China or Korea or Russia or Brazil, they've also taken on these things and accepted them as sort of the dominant system of how people operate around the world. And it was the Americans who drove that idea forward and spread it around the world. Finally, we got to the 11th and 12th section. The 11th section is pretty short and simple. You just need to know about Hollywood. All that information is on the website. And then I briefly talked about underlying forces that drove American popular culture. And I gave 2 examples of that: American sports and American music. And that lecture was only a couple weeks ago. Finally, at the end, the last section is section 12. You need to know the basic things of each branch of the American system. So that's the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. I almost forgot for a second. The judges, the president, and the elected people, and what their roles are. Basically, you need to understand that. I mentioned a few important presidents: Roosevelt, Kennedy, and Reagan. Of course, Donald Trump has come up many times, but I'm not going to ask you a Trump question. It's too fresh. And with the things, I know I put it on the study guide, but don't study anything about Trump. I don't want to get in trouble. It's a mess, in my opinion. And that it's much better to teach these things after they happen than while they're happening. But suffice to say, Donald Trump is not, in some ways, he's not exceptional, because this is a system that has not been fixed. It's continued for a long time, and it doesn't really matter who the president is. Obama did a good job of managing the system despite the fact that it had some serious problems. But at some point, these problems with healthcare, these problems with racial inequality, were going to boil over, and they don't have necessarily. I know Donald Trump might not be the ideal person to handle it, but these things are systemic, so they've existed for long. Donald Trump didn't create them. He's just not doing a good job of managing them. That's all I want to say. That's not going to be on the exam. I really hope for all of my American friends and for America itself that things get better. That's all I want to say. In terms of Great Britain, the last thing I said was, what is British identity now? It has become very multicultural compared to what you imagine, all the Anglo-Saxon stuff. Well, I was trying to say to you, it's not as monocultural as you think. The British are multicultural already, but when the British Empire started to dissolve and people started coming from all over the place, not just from Normandy and the Netherlands and from Viking areas like Scandinavia, Swedish people and Germans and stuff, those people have already been mixed in. But now you have people from the Caribbean and from South America and from Africa and from Asia and from Australia. They have all kinds of people from South Asia, from India and Pakistan. Now, before it was multicultural, but people sort of looked somewhat similar. But now you have Jamaicans and Pakistanis and Kenyans and people walking around on the street. They all look different. Brazilians, they all look different. So you notice the multiculturalism more. England has been a fairly multicultural place for most of its history, but now it's visibly multicultural, which is a different thing. Accepting that or not accepting that has a lot to do with the Brexit question. You don't have to know why or really, you need to know why, in the sense that Brexit is an attempt at England to control itself, of the United Kingdom to separate itself from the European Union. I don't really know exactly why they want to do that, but the bottom line is the British want to control themselves. They want their sovereignty. Remember that word from the Civil War in the 17th century? Who is in control of the United Kingdom, right? Parliament, the king, or the European Union? They want Parliament to be in control of it again. That's one of the basic things that drove the vote for Brexit in the direction that it did. So Winston Churchill, I mentioned, controversial figure. Talking about him when he was prime minister would have been a very dangerous thing. He wouldn't have wanted me to say anything bad about him when he was, doing certain things, imperialist things, and being very strict and forcing people to do things in order to make the war effort more effective. So again, looking back, hindsight is 2020. Winston Churchill has some obvious. He's one of the most important people in British history because he was one of the main reasons that they were able to defend themselves against the Nazis and to ultimately beat Adolf Hitler. But he had so many faults, personal faults, and faults as a politician, that he was actually voted out before the war was over. I just find that ridiculous. But that is the beauty of British culture, and American too, is that they can pivot in a new direction so quickly. It is a very quickly evolving culture, and it's hard to keep track of it. It's hard to create a course like this where everything, sort of connects together, because there have been so many changes. But I hope in studying all this, you can see there is basically, as I said, in British culture especially, it's basically a conservative culture. They do evolve, but they don't have real revolutions. And they always hang on to stuff as long as they can. So Winston Churchill was one of those people. He didn't want to let the British Empire go, even though it was time. Declinism is a part of that. Declinism is the perspective that England now is worse than it was before. But that's not true. It's just relatively less strong compared to other countries got stronger. And they should. Like, China was very weak when the British Empire was really strong. But is that the way it should have been? Probably not. So now China is the second most powerful country in the world. And the United Kingdom is, I don't know, the 10th. But that's where they belong. And they're more powerful. They have a bigger economy. They have a bigger population. They're just relatively less important. So that's the idea of declinism, is that they're not number one anymore. So it doesn't matter what position they are. In the 19th century, when Queen Victoria was Empress of India, that was the golden age of the British, because they were the most important people in the world. And now they're not. Which is true. They are not. And I think that's part of the Brexit thing too, is they want to be able to control themselves, and they want to feel that they're important, because in the EU, they're less important than they are if they're on their own. That's just my personal analysis. So focus on all the things. I've just finished the entire thing. Somehow I tried to do it as fast as possible. I hope you could keep up. If you're listening to this, you should have your study guide in front of you. I should have mentioned that at the beginning. But you don't need to be exhaustive. You don't need to know everything about every point. Just make some notes about each heading, each main point that I put. If you do that, you'll do well on the exam. That's all you need to do. If you can do a rundown of the basic overview of all of the points, sort of like I did in the last 30 minutes, and all you have to do is circle a multiple choice question and then write 2 short answers at the end, you'll do well on the exam. That's all that's required. So, as I say to all my students at the end of this, not only do I hope that you understand British and American culture better, but I hope that in studying and understanding all of these things, all these changes and all these events and their significance, and trying to put your head, get yourself imagine yourself in the 17th century, or imagine yourself in a society that's experiencing the Black Death. I hope that it will make you a better person, it will make you a better citizen, it will help you understand not only British and American culture, but I hope it will help you understand your own culture. And when you go to different places around the world, you'll be able to look at it and you'll be able to unpack it and see, this is how they do things here, and this is connected to this, and this is very interesting to me. Why do they do it this way? And when you find out, you'll be like, well, just like Professor Sullivan said, hundreds of years ago, people did things, and they're still connected to the things that we do today. So thank you very much for listening to me. I know some of my lectures are very long, so I will stop for this semester, and next semester I will attempt to condense things further and make them more manageable for you. I hope you enjoyed the class, and I look forward to seeing you finally next Thursday. That's the exam review. Thank you. Have a good night.